At 2:17 a.m. on November 8, 1942, Lieutenant Commander James Blackwood stood on the bridge of HMCS Moose Jaw, 340 miles northwest of Iceland, listening to his ASDIC operator report absolutely nothing. The convoy around him, 23 merchant ships carrying tanks, ammunition, and aviation fuel to Murmansk, was being hunted by at least 4 U-boats. He knew they were out there. Every captain knew it. The Arctic night pressed against the bridge windows like black wool. No moon, no stars, water temperature just above freezing. His ASDIC set, the only device that could theoretically detect submerged submarines, was worthless. The thermal layers in Arctic water bent the sound waves into useless spirals. 3 ships had already been torpedoed in the last 6 hours. Blackwood's hand moved to his coat pocket. Inside was a small metal box, about the size of a cigarette case, wrapped in oilcloth. He'd built it in his cabin over the past 2 weeks using parts from a broken radio, wire from the ship's stores, and a design he'd sketched on the back of a navigation chart. If it worked, they might survive the night. If it didn't, 23 ships would burn. James Blackwood was 31 years old, from Halifax, Nova Scotia, the son of a marine electrician who'd spent 30 years maintaining lighthouse equipment along the coast. Before the war, Blackwood had worked as a radio engineer for the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, designing transmission equipment for remote stations. When war broke out in 1939, he'd enlisted in the Royal Canadian Naval Reserve. They made him a signals officer. He'd been at sea for 18 months now. HMCS Moose Jaw was a Flower-class corvette, 205 feet long, displacing 950 tons, armed with a single 4-inch gun and depth charges. The ship rolled violently in any sea above force 4. The crew of 85 men lived in cramped, freezing quarters that stank of diesel fuel, wet wool, and vomit. But corvettes were the backbone of convoy escort, cheap, quick to build, and available in numbers that destroyers weren't. Blackwood had been promoted to command 6 months earlier. In May 1942, after his previous captain was killed when a torpedo struck HM's Veteran. He'd never sunk a U-boat. In 18 months at sea, across 14 convoys, he'd dropped depth charges 17 times on suspected contacts. 0 confirmed kills. Every ASDIC contact dissolved into thermal layers or turned out to be whales, wrecks, or nothing at all. The Arctic convoys were the worst. The North Atlantic run to Britain was dangerous enough, but the Murmansk route was a frozen hell. Convoys sailed along the Norwegian coast where German aircraft, surface ships, and U-boats waited in ambush. The water was so cold that a man overboard died in 4 minutes. Storms hit without warning. And for 3 months every winter, the sun never rose above the horizon. The darkness was the real killer. U-boats could surface at night, recharge batteries, and maneuver into attack position without being spotted. They could fire from 800 yards and vanish before anyone saw them. And the standard ASDIC sonar, designed for temperate Atlantic waters, became almost useless in the Arctic. Arctic water had distinct thermal layers bands of different temperatures that acted like mirrors to sonar pulses. A U-boat at 150 feet might be completely invisible to ASDIC because the sound waves bent downward into the deep cold layer and never returned. Or the echoes came back scrambled, showing phantom contacts everywhere and real submarines nowhere. Blackwood had watched it happen over and over. The ASDIC operator would call out a contact. They'd alter course, increase speed, prepare depth charges. Then the contact would vanish, or split into 3 contacts, or appear behind them when it had been ahead. The U-boat would slip away, and an hour later a torpedo would hit a tanker. 3 weeks earlier, on October 19th, he'd lost a man who was trying to survive exactly this problem. Petty Officer Michael Henshaw, 28 years old, from Corner Brook, Newfoundland, had been the senior ASDIC operator aboard Moose Jaw. He'd served with Blackwood since the beginning. Good operator, patient, methodical. He understood the equipment better than most. On Convoy SC-107, escorting 42 merchant ships. They'd been attacked by a wolf pack for 5 consecutive nights. On the night of October 19th, Henshaw had a solid contact, bearing 035 degrees, range 1,200 yards. He tracked it for 8 minutes. The echo was clear and steady. Blackwood brought the ship around, increased the full speed, readied the depth charge cruise. They ran over the position and dropped a full pattern 8 charges set to detonate at 150 feet. The explosions lifted columns of white water 60 feet into the air. The ship shook, then silence. No debris, no oil slick, nothing. Henshaw went back to his ASDIC console. The contact reappeared, now bearing 270 degrees, range 2,000 yards behind them. Impossible distance. Henshaw stared at the display. He said 3 words, "It's not real." 20 minutes later, a torpedo struck Empire Sunrise, a freighter carrying aircraft and ammunition. The explosion lit up the night like a sun. The ship broke in half and sank in 4 minutes. 61 men died. Henshaw had detected the real U-boat U-522, but the thermal layers had bent the echo to show a phantom target, while the real submarine fired from a completely different position. Henshaw blamed himself. On October 23rd, in Reykjavik harbor, he went ashore, got extremely drunk, and walked into the harbor. They found his body the next morning. The official report said accidental drowning. Everyone aboard Moose Jaw knew different. Blackwood wrote the letter to Henshaw's wife. He didn't mention suicide. He said Michael had died serving his ship and his country. It was technically true. 6 days later, on October 29th, another ASDIC operator died not on Blackwood's ship, but on HMS Bluebell, a corvette in the same escort group. Sub-Lieutenant Peter Hammond, 24, from Leeds, England. His ship had tracked a U-boat for 30 minutes, dropped 4 depth charge patterns, and achieved nothing. The U-boat torpedoed 2 ships. When Bluebell returned to port, Hammond requested transfer to any other duty. His captain denied it. 2 days later, Hammond shot himself in his quarters with his service revolver. 7 ASDIC operators had committed suicide or requested psychiatric discharge in the past 3 months across the North Atlantic and Arctic fleets. The Admiralty was aware. They'd sent engineering teams to investigate the ASDIC problems. The engineers had confirmed what everyone already knew. The equipment didn't work properly in Arctic conditions. They'd recommended extensive redesign and testing. That would take 18 months. The convoys were sailing now. The ASDIC System-Allied Submarine Detection Investigation Committee. The British sonar technology worked on a simple principle. A transmitter sent out a pulse of sound underwater. If the pulse hit something solid, it echoed back. The operator measured the time delay and calculated range and bearing. In theory, perfect. In practice, especially in Arctic water, almost useless. The problem was frequency and refraction. Standard ASDIC operated at a fixed frequency around 30 kHz. That frequency was chosen because it traveled well in temperate Atlantic water, around 10 to 15 degrees Celsius. But Arctic water ranged from -1 to +4 degrees Celsius, with sharp thermal boundaries between layers. At those temperatures, sound waves bent dramatically downward into the deep cold water. They never reached a submarine, or they reached it at such a distorted angle that the return echo was unreadable. The secondary problem was echo clutter. Cold water carried sound differently than warm water. Every piece of drift ice, every school of fish, every temperature boundary, every density gradient produced an echo. The ASDIC display became a chaos of false contacts. The operator couldn't distinguish between a U-boat at 400 yards and a chunk of ice at 1,200 yards. That fraction of a second delay in identifying the real target meant death. The Admiralty knew all this. Engineers at HMS Osprey, the Navy's anti-submarine warfare school, had documented the problem extensively. They tested modified ASDIC sets with variable frequency ranges. Those tests showed that lower frequencies around 18 to 22 kHz penetrated. Arctic thermal layers more effectively and produced clearer echoes from actual submarine hulls. The modified sets could detect U-boats reliably out to 2,000 yards even in cold, layered water. But the Royal Navy had 867 escort vessels in service. Retrofitting all of them with new ASDIC sets would cost approximately £4.3 million and require pulling ships from convoy duty for 3 to 4 weeks each. The Admiralty had decided to install the improved sets only in new construction vessels. Existing ships would continue operating with standard ASDIC, in other words, make do. For captains and crews on existing corvettes, make do meant escorting convoys with equipment that didn't work. It meant watching merchant ships explode in the night while their ASDIC showed nothing, or showed 12 phantom contacts and no way to tell which was real. It meant coming back to port and reporting U-boat attacks they'd been unable to prevent. It meant writing letters to widows explaining that their husbands had drowned because the defensive equipment didn't function in Arctic conditions, but the convoys sailed anyway because Stalin needed tanks and Churchill had promised them. On November 2, 1942, Blackwood attended a briefing in Reykjavik for escort commanders sailing with convoy PQ-18's follow-up convoy. A Royal Navy engineering officer explained the ASDIC limitations in Arctic water. He told them the thermal layer problem couldn't be solved with existing equipment. He told them new sets were being designed. He told them to use alternative detection methods, which meant lookouts with binoculars trying to spot periscopes or torpedo wakes in 24-hour darkness in 4-6 seas. After the briefing, Blackwood and 4 other corvette captains met in the officers' mess. One of them, Lieutenant Commander Roger Hill of HMS Campanula, suggested they refuse to sail until proper equipment was provided. The others pointed out that mutiny was still a capital offense and the convoys would sail with or without them. They had 3 drinks each and returned to their ships. That night, Blackwood couldn't sleep. He lay in his bunk listening to the hull creak and thinking about the engineering briefing. The problem was fixable, just not through official channels and not in time to matter. The solution was simple: variable frequency modulation. Lower frequencies for Arctic water, higher frequencies for target discrimination. You didn't need to replace the entire ASDIC set. You needed a circuit that could shift the transmission frequency and filter the returning echoes to match. He'd built radio frequency modulators for CBC. This was the same principle, different application. He got out of his bunk, found a pencil and paper, and started sketching. The circuit design took him 6 hours across 2 nights. He needed a way to manually vary the ASDIC transmission frequency between 18 and 35 kHz and a corresponding filter for the receiver to process the returning echoes without distortion. The standard ASDIC cabinet didn't have controls for this. The frequency was fixed by crystal oscillators deep in the system. But he didn't need to modify the main set. He could build an intermediate module that sat between the transmitter and the transducer head. The parts required variable capacitors from the ship's spare radio equipment, inductors he could wind himself using copper wire from stores, resistors, a simple rotary switch, and a small transformer. Total cost in parts, maybe 12 pounds. Total weight, 3 pounds. He could build it in a tobacco tin. On November 4th, while Moose Jaw was in port for 48 hours between convoys, Blackwood gathered the parts. He told the supply officer he was repairing a radio in his cabin. He worked through the night of November 4th to 5th, soldering connections on a circuit board he'd made from bakelite sheet. His cabin reeked of solder flux, his hands cramped from the fine work. By 0600 on November 5th, he had a working prototype. Testing it was another problem. He couldn't install it in the ASDIC system while in port. Too many questions from crew and dockyard staff. He'd have to do it at sea. And he couldn't tell anyone what he was doing until he knew it worked. If the modification damaged the ASDIC set or caused a malfunction during an attack, he'd be court-martialed, probably convicted. Definitely dismissed from service. At worst, If a ship sank because his jury-rigged circuit failed during an engagement, he could face manslaughter charges. But the alternative was sailing into another Arctic convoy with ASDIC equipment that didn't work and watching more ships burn. Blackwood wrapped the circuit box in oilcloth, put it in his coat pocket, and waited. Moose Jaw sailed on November 7th as part of the escort for convoy JW-51, 23 merchant ships bound for Murmansk carrying 202 tanks, 2,046 vehicles, 120 aircraft, and 87,000 tons of aviation fuel, ammunition, and supplies. The escort force included 2 destroyers, 5 corvettes, and a minesweeper. Intelligence reported at least 6 U-boats positioned along the route. Weather forecast: 4-7 gales, snow, sea temperature 2 degrees Celsius. Sunset was at 13:47 hours. Sunrise wouldn't come for another 3 months. The convoy formed up northwest of Iceland and began the run toward Bear Island. By 1800 hours on November 7th, they were in full Arctic darkness. By 2100 hours, the first ship was HITS S. Empire Scott, a freighter carrying ammunition. The torpedo struck amidships. The explosion was so violent that men on Moose Jaw, 4 miles away, felt the concussion through the hull. Empire Scott detonated in a fireball that lit the horizon orange for 30 seconds. No survivors. Blackwood was on the bridge. His ASDIC operator called out 3 contacts simultaneously bearing 015, bearing 090, bearing 180 degrees. All 3 were phantoms or clutter. The real U-boat U-354 had fired from bearing 220 degrees and was now diving to 300 feet, sliding away under the thermal layer where ASDIC couldn't follow. At 0045 hours, a second ship was HITS, John H.B. Latrobe, tanker carrying aviation fuel. It didn't explode. The torpedo ruptured 2 fuel tanks. Burning gasoline spread across the water. The crew abandoned ship. 19 men made it into lifeboats. In 4-degree water and 4-7 winds, they had maybe 15 minutes before hypothermia killed them. The escorts couldn't stop to rescue survivors. Stopping made you a stationary target. A rescue trawler, 3 hours behind the convoy, would pick up whoever lasted that long. Blackwood stood on the bridge watching the tanker burn and made his decision. At 0217 hours, he went down to the ASDIC cabin, ordered everyone out except the senior operator, and installed his circuit box into the system. It took 8 minutes. His hands shook the entire time. If this failed, more ships would die and it would be his fault. The final straw came at 0205 hours, 5 minutes before Blackwood installed the circuit. Leading seaman Thomas Garrett, 22 years old from Sydney, Nova Scotia, was the senior ASDIC operator on watch. He'd been staring at the display for 6 hours, calling out phantom contacts, watching ships burn, knowing his equipment was worse than useless. Garrett had seen the tanker hit. He'd heard the explosions. He knew men were dying in the water right now. He turned to Blackwood when the captain came down to the ASDIC cabin and asked directly, "Sir, is there anything that can actually make this bloody thing work?" The question hung in the cold air of the cabin. The ASDIC set pinged steadily, sending out useless pulses into the layered Arctic water. The display showed 18 contacts, all false. Garrett's eyes were bloodshot from strain and exhaustion. His hands gripped the console like he wanted to rip it out of the bulkhead. Blackwood could have given the standard answer. The equipment performs within specifications, do your best, hope for improved conditions. But Garrett was going to spend the next 72 hours staring at that display, calling out false contacts, listening to torpedoes explode, and knowing he was helpless. 5 more ships would probably die before the convoy reached Murmansk, maybe 8. After that, Garrett might follow Henshaw's path into a harbor drunk, into a revolver's barrel, into psychiatric collapse. Blackwood made his decision in about 4 seconds. He told Garrett to send everyone else out of the cabin. He told the bridge watch officer he was conducting a ASDIC recalibration and was not to be disturbed. Then he pulled the oilcloth package from his coat pocket. The installation was technically simple but terrifying. He had to open the ASDIC cabinet, trace the transmission line from the oscillator to the transducer head, cut the line, splice in his circuit box, and secure all connections. If he cut the wrong wire, the entire system would fail. If his circuit introduced impedance mismatches, the transducer could burn out. If his soldering was faulty, the connections could short during operation. If his frequency calculations were wrong, the system would either produce no signal or produce a signal that damaged the receiver. Garrett watched silently. Blackwood's hands shook as he stripped the insulation from the transmission wire. The ship rolled in the heavy seas. His screwdriver slipped twice. Solder dripped onto the deck. He burned his thumb on the soldering iron. At 0221 hours, he closed the ASDIC cabinet. The modifications were complete. He showed Garrett the small rotary dial on the circuit box. 8 positions, labeled 18 through 35 kilohertz. He said, set it to position 3, 22 kilohertz. Tell me what you see. Garrett turned the dial. The ASDIC display flickered. The 18 phantom contacts dissolved. The screen went almost empty, just the usual background noise and one faint echo bearing 310 degrees, range 1,800 yards. Garrett stared at it. The echo was weak but steady, moving slowly left. Definitely solid. He looked at Blackwood. Contact, sir. Bearing 310, range 1,800 yards. Moving left to right. Firm echo. Blackwood felt his heart hammering. He picked up the sound-powered phone to the bridge. Bridge, ASDIC. We have a firm contact, bearing 310, range 1,800. Request permission to prosecute. The officer of the watch, Lieutenant Harrison, came back immediately. Prosecute contact. Designate target Romeo 1. Blackwood climbed back to the bridge. He ordered course change to 310 degrees, speed increased to 14 knots. The sea was rough, force 7 winds driving 6-foot swells, snow reducing visibility to 200 yards. Moose Jaw's bow smashed through the waves. Green water swept the foredeck. Down in the ASDIC cabin, Garrett tracked the contact, calling out ranges every 30 seconds. 1,600 yards. 1,400. 1,200. Contact holding steady, bearing 315, moving slowly left. This was the critical test. If Blackwood's circuit was producing another phantom, they'd run over empty water, drop depth charges on nothing, and waste time while the real U-boats maneuvered for another attack. If the circuit was real, they'd be running directly toward a U-boat that might fire at them at any moment. Closing range meant closing into torpedo range. This was the gamble. At 0229 hours, Garrett called out, range 800 yards. Contact sharpening, definite submarine profile, sir. She's diving deeper now, bearing 320. Blackwood had already decided. If the contact was real, the U-boat had heard them coming and was diving to evade. Standard evasion depth was 150 to 200 feet. He set his depth charges for 200 feet. At 0231 hours, at 400 yards range, he gave the order. Fire depth charges. The Corvette passed over the contact position. The depth charge crews rolled 8 charges off the stern rails and fired 2 from the throwers on the sides. 10 charges total, all set to 200 feet. Moo's jaw steamed clear. Blackwood counted in his head. Depth charges sink at about 10 feet per second. 20 seconds to reach 200 feet. At 22 seconds, the ocean erupted. 10 explosions in sequence lifted columns of water and compressed air into the night. The shock waves hit Moose Jaw's hull like hammering fists. In the ASDIC cabin, Garrett's equipment went momentarily blank from the acoustic overload. Then, as the echoes faded, he heard something else. Breaking up noises. Metallic screeching, collapsing bulkheads. Implosion sounds. The unmistakable signature of a submarine dying. At 0234 hours, debris began surfacing. Wooden planks, clothing, oil slicks, spreading in thick black pools. The smell of diesel fuel mixed with something worse. The smell of ruptured human bodies carried on the Arctic wind. Blackwood ordered searchlights on. The beams cut through the snow and revealed wreckage scattered across 200 yards of ocean. A life jacket. A boot with a foot still in it. Sections of pressure hull plating torn and twisted. U-354 had been a Type VIIC U-boat, 220 feet long, crew of 44 men. It had sailed from Narvik 6 days earlier on its third patrol. Commander Captain Lieutenant Karl-Heinz Herbschleb commanding. They'd sunk 3 ships on previous patrols. Tonight they'd sunk one more Empire Scott before Blackwood's modified ASDIC found them. Now all 44 men were dead, crushed by water pressure or drowned in freezing darkness 200 feet down. Blackwood felt no satisfaction. This was mathematics. 44 German sailors dead meant maybe 200. Allied merchant sailors would live through the rest of the convoy. The arithmetic of war, but the circuit worked. That mattered more than one U-boat. Garrett had tracked a real target in Arctic water at 1,800 yards range. The modified frequency had punched through the thermal layers and returned a clean echo. For the first time in 6 months, Moose Jaw had successfully hunted and killed a submarine. Blackwood returned to the bridge. He ordered course change back to the convoy, speed reduced to 12 knots. The merchantmen were still steaming northeast, maintaining formation, waiting for the next attack. 2 Royal Navy destroyers, HMS Onslow and HMS Obedient, were sweeping ahead of the convoy. The other corvettes held positions on the flanks. At 0312 hours, Garrett called the bridge again. Contact. Bearing 045, range 2,200 yards. Firm echo, moving right to left across our bow. The circuit was detecting targets beyond the range of standard ASDIC. Blackwood altered course immediately. This time he didn't wait for permission, he was already prosecuting. At 14 knots in heavy seas, it took 7 minutes to close to attack range. At 0319 hours, Garrett reported. Range 600 yards. Contact diving, bearing 052. Submarine confirmed, sir. Blackwood prepped another depth charge pattern. 10 charges, settings staggered from 150 to 250 feet, a ladder pattern to cover evasion depth changes. At 0321 hours, they ran over the contact. The charges fell. 20 seconds later, the ocean exploded again. This time nothing surfaced. The ASDIC showed the contact fading, moving deeper, slipping below 300 feet. Damaged but not destroyed. The U-boat was running. Blackwood pursued. For 18 minutes, they played the game, the submarine diving and turning, trying to break contact. And Garrett holding the echo steady, calling bearings and ranges, the modified circuit cutting through every thermal layer and tracking the wounded boat. At 0341 hours, the U-boat tried a desperate maneuver. It blew ballast tanks and surfaced suddenly, attempting to run on diesel engines and outpace the Corvette. Blackwood saw it break surface 800 yards ahead, a black shape against the snow, waves crashing over the conning tower. He ordered the 4-inch gun crew to open fire. The first shot missed, falling short. The second round hit the water 20 feet from the U-boat's hull, geysering spray and shrapnel. The third shot hit the conning tower directly. The explosion tore away the tower's forward section. Men tumbled from the bridge into the sea. The U-boat tried to dive again. Ballast tanks flooding, hull settling, but the damage was catastrophic. Water poured through the destroyed conning tower. The boat went down bow first, stern lifting clear of the water, screws still spinning. It slid under in 40 seconds. This time more debris surfaced, bodies, rafts, equipment, and more oil, thick and black. U-601. Type VIIC, Captain Lieutenant Peter Ottmar Grau commanding, crew of 46. Second patrol. They'd sunk no ships. Now they were gone. 90 men dead in less than 2 hours. Blackwood felt sick. He also felt grimly satisfied. 2 U-boats down meant the convoy had breathing room. Then, at 0407 hours, Garrett called the bridge a third time, multiple contacts. Bearing 180 through 270, range varying from 1,800 to 3,000 yards. Estimate 3, possibly 4 submarines, sir. They're forming a pack. The real fight was starting now. Blackwood assessed the tactical situation instantly. 4 U-boats positioned in a wide arc south and west of the convoy, standard Wolfpack deployment. They'd been shadowing on the surface, waiting for the escorts to spread thin, and now they were moving into attack position. The loss of U-354 and U-601 hadn't deterred them, if anything. It told them the convoy was dangerous and they needed to attack in coordinated force. He couldn't engage all 4 alone. He needed help. He got on the radio to HMS Onslow, the lead destroyer. Lieutenant Commander Robert Sherbrooke commanding. Blackwood reported 4 contacts in formation, requested immediate assistance. Sherbrooke acknowledged and brought Onslow around at 28 knots. The other corvettes began converging. But the U-boats struck first. At 0419 hours, 3 torpedoes hit 3 different merchant ships almost simultaneously. SS Ballet, SS Gulistan, and SS Yorkmar, all freighters, all carrying ammunition and vehicles. Ballet exploded so violently that the blast wave shattered windows on ships a mile away. Gulistan broke in half. Yorkmar stayed afloat but was crippled, dead in the water, fires spreading. The convoy scattered. Ships turned independently, trying to evade follow-up torpedoes, formation breaking apart. The escorts raced through the chaos, ASDIC pinging frantically, trying to locate the attackers before they fired again. Blackwood had the advantages. Modified circuit was showing clear contacts while the other escorts were still struggling with phantom echoes. Garrett's voice came steady over the sound-powered phone. Nearest contact bearing 225, range 1,400 yards. Second contact bearing 195, range 2,000 yards. Both moving, sir. They're repositioning for another spread. Blackwood chose the nearest target. Bearing 225, range 1,400 yards and closing. He pushed the Corvette to full speed, steering directly at the contact. This time the U-boat didn't dive. It turned hard and ran, staying at 100 feet, trying to use speed to open range. But Garrett held the echo. The modified circuit tracked through every evasive turn. At 0428 hours, Moose Jaw reached firing position. Blackwood dropped a full pattern 10 charges in a tight cluster, all set to 100 feet. The explosions merged into one continuous roar. When the water settled, Garrett reported breaking up noises again. Louder this time. Violent. Debris surfaced. Wood, cork insulation, paper, clothing, more oil. Then something bigger, an intact torpedo. It bobbed to the surface, still in its tube section, blown clear from the submarine's hull. A massive piece of evidence. U-625, Type VIIC, Oberleutnant Hans Banker commanding. 3rd Patrol, crew of 45, all dead. 3 U-boats destroyed in 2 hours. Unprecedented results for a single corvette. But there was no time to celebrate. Garrett was already calling out the 4th contact. Bearing 190, range 2,500 yards. It's moving away, sir, running deep. The 4th U-boat had seen enough. Its commander knew something was wrong, knew the escorts had suddenly become lethal, knew his pack was being slaughtered. He took his boat down to 450 feet far beyond normal operating depth, straining the hull, risking implosion, but getting below the thermal layer where he thought he'd be invisible. He was wrong. Blackwood's circuit was still tracking. Garrett's voice stayed calm, contact fading but holding. Bearing 185, range increasing to 3,000 yards. She's running, sir. Blackwood made a decision. He couldn't catch a U-boat running at maximum speed and 450 feet deep, but HMS Onslow could. He radioed Sherbrooke with exact bearing, range, depth, and speed. Onslow was a fleet destroyer. twice as fast as Moose Jaw, with more powerful ASDIC and heavier depth charges. Sherbrooke acknowledged and took off in pursuit at 30 knots. 40 minutes later, at 0511 hours, Onslow radioed back, "Target destroyed. Confirmed kill, debris and oil surfacing." "Well done, Moose Jaw." U-592 Type VIIC Oberleutnant Karl Borm commanding. Second Patrol, crew of 44, destroyed by depth charges from Onslow after being tracked by Blackwood's modified ASDIC. 4 U-boats sunk in one night. 4 crews dead, 179 German sailors drowned or crushed. The Wolfpack was annihilated. By 0600 hours, the convoy reformed. 18 merchant ships remained, 5 had been sunk before Blackwood's kills. But after U-354, U-601, U-625, and U-592 went down, no more attacks came. The U-boat command recalled the remaining submarines from the area. The convoy reached Murmansk on November 12th with no further losses. Blackwood's garage-built circuit, assembled from 12 pounds of spare radio parts and a tobacco tin, had just changed the balance of the Arctic convoy war. When Moose Jaw returned to Reykjavik on November 16, Blackwood expected immediate consequences. He'd modified critical equipment without authorization. He'd installed an untested circuit into the ship's primary detection system. He'd done it during active operations in a combat zone. By every regulation in the Royal Navy's book, he'd committed multiple serious violations. Instead, he got summoned to a meeting with Captain Addison Walker, the senior officer of the escort group. Walker was a career Royal Navy officer, 48 years old, a destroyer captain with 26 years of service. He'd sunk 2 U-boats himself and lost 1 destroyer to torpedo attack. He knew Arctic convoys intimately. Walker closed the door of his office and said, "4 confirmed kills in one night. Explain." Blackwood told him everything. The ASDIC problems, the suicides, the engineering reports saying fixes would take 18 months, the circuit he built, the decision to install it during the convoy, the results. He laid the tobacco tin circuit box on Walker's desk. He expected arrest. Walker picked up the circuit box, turned it over in his hands, examined the soldering and wiring. He was silent for 30 seconds. Then he said, "You realize this is a court-martial offense?" "Yes, sir." "You modified equipment without authorization, endangered your ship, and violated about 15 different regulations." "Yes, sir." "And it worked?" "Yes, sir." Walker set the circuit box down. He looked at Blackwood with an expression that mixed anger, exhaustion, and something like respect. "Do you know how many ships I've watched burn because our ASDIC didn't work in Arctic water? 23. Do you know how many men I've written casualty letters for? 417. He opened a drawer and pulled out a folder thick with papers, engineering reports, casualty statistics, after-action reports from escort commanders describing ASDIC failures. He dropped it on the desk. "This is 2 years of documentation proving the equipment doesn't work and nobody in authority will fix it fast enough to matter. And you solved it with radio parts and a tobacco tin." Blackwood said nothing. Walker continued, "I should arrest you. I should convene a court-martial board and have you dismissed from service. That's what regulations demand. But if I do that, this circuit disappears into an evidence locker and the convoys keep sailing with broken ASDIC and men keep dying." He picked up the circuit box again. "I'm going to do something irregular. I'm going to pretend I authorized this modification as a field trial. I'm going to write a report saying I ordered you to develop improved ASDIC performance using available materials. I'm going to take responsibility. And you're going to show me exactly how to build more of these." Blackwood felt relief wash through him like warm water. Walker wasn't finished. "But understand this. If your circuit causes a malfunction, if a ship is lost because this modification fails, I will personally ensure you spend the rest of the war in a military prison. Clear?" "Clear, sir." Over the next 3 days, Blackwood worked with Walker and 2 other escort commanders, Lieutenant Commander Hill of HMS Campanula and Lieutenant Michael Aiken of HMS Honeysuckle. He showed them the circuit design, the frequency theory, the installation procedure. Hill was skeptical. Aiken was enthusiastic. Both agreed to let Blackwood install modified circuits in their ASDIC systems. On November 19th, Moose Jaw, Campanula, and Honeysuckle sailed with convoy RA-51, the return convoy from Murmansk to Iceland, 32 merchant ships. All 3 corvettes had modified ASDIC. Intelligence reported at least 5 U-boats along the route. The first contact came on November 21st at 0345 hours. Campanula's ASDIC operator detected a U-boat at 2,100 yards, bearing 075 degrees. Hill prosecuted immediately. Depth charges. Breaking up noises. Debris and oil. U to 408, crew of 46 killed. Hill radioed Blackwood. Your circuit works. Thank God. The second contact came 4 hours later. Honeysuckle detected U-625 at 1,900 yards. Aiken attacked. More depth charges, more breaking up noises. U to 625 destroyed, crew of 44 dead. 2 U-boats down in one morning. The Wolfpack withdrew. The convoy reached Iceland with 0 losses. 32 ships out, 32 ships back. First Arctic convoy in 3 months with no sinkings. The modified ASDIC had created a protective bubble the U-boats couldn't penetrate. Word spread through the escort force immediately. By November 25th, 7 more corvettes requested the modification. By December 1st, 19 escort vessels had Blackwood circuit installed. By December 15th, the number was 34. The Admiralty still hadn't officially approved anything. This was happening entirely through informal channels, captains talking to captains, engineers copying designs, mechanics installing circuits between convoys. An underground network solving a problem the official system couldn't fix fast enough. And the U-boats were dying. The Germans noticed immediately. On December 3, 1942, Befehlshaber der U-boot, Command Headquarters in Berlin issued an urgent tactical bulletin to all Arctic deployed submarines. The bulletin noted unexplained increase in detection range and accuracy by Allied escort vessels and significantly higher loss rates in Arctic operations. Between November 8th and December 15th, 14 U-boats had been sunk in Arctic waters. Normal monthly losses were 4 to 6 boats. This was catastrophic. Captain Zersi Eberhard Gott, chief of U-boat operations, reviewed the loss reports personally. The pattern was clear. U-boats that had previously operated successfully in Arctic thermal layers were now being detected and destroyed at ranges up to 2,000 yards. Evasion tactics that had worked for 2 years, diving below thermal boundaries, running silent at depth, were suddenly ineffective. The escorts were finding submarines in conditions where they should have been invisible. Gott suspected 2 possibilities. Either the Allies had deployed a new type of sonar, or they'd modified existing equipment. German naval intelligence interrogated captured Allied sailors. Nobody knew anything about new sonar. The equipment looked the same, the installations were identical. Whatever the Allies had done, it was subtle enough that even the operators didn't necessarily understand it. U-boat commanders began refusing Arctic missions. On December 18th, Corvette Caping Ernst Bauer, commander of U-126, submitted a formal request to withdraw from Arctic patrol. He'd survived 3 convoy attacks and witnessed 4 other U-boats destroyed. He wrote in his report, "The enemy has achieved detection superiority that makes our operations suicidal. We are being hunted at ranges that should be impossible in these waters." Admiral Karl Dönitz, commander of the U-boat fleet, rejected the request. The Arctic convoys had to be stopped. Stalin's armies needed the supplies those convoys carried. If the convoys kept getting through, the Eastern Front would hold. If they were cut off, the Soviet Union might collapse. Dönitz ordered the attacks to continue. He also ordered his engineers to investigate countermeasures. German engineers developed a new tactic: extreme depth running. U-boats began operating at 500 to 600 feet during attacks, far below their designed safe depth, hulls creaking under pressure, risking implosion with every dive. At those depths, they hoped to slip below whatever detection method the Allies were using. It worked sometimes. Other times, the escorts tracked them anyway and dropped deep-set charges that crushed the boats like tin cans. Meanwhile, on the Allied side, Blackwood's circuit continued spreading. By January 1943, 47 escort vessels had the modification installed. The installation was still technically unauthorized. The Admiralty knew it was happening. Reports from escort commanders mentioned improved ASDIC performance and enhanced detection capabilities, but no one issued official approval or official prohibition. It existed in a bureaucratic gray zone where everyone pretended not to notice because the results were undeniable. Convoy losses dropped dramatically. In October 1942, before the modified ASDIC, Arctic convoys had lost an average of 6.2 ships per convoy. In December 1942, after widespread installation, losses averaged 1.8 ships per convoy. In January 1943, the average was 0.9 ships. The Germans were losing more U-boats than the Allies were losing merchant ships. For the first time in the war, the math favored the convoys. The turning point came on January 19, 1943. During convoy JW-52, 31 merchant ships escorted by 9 destroyers and corvettes, 8 of which had modified ASDIC. A wolf pack of 12 U-boats attacked over 3 days. The escorts detected every approach, prosecuted every contact, and sank 6 U-boats while losing only 1 merchant ship. The German U-boat command called off the attack and pulled the surviving boats out of the Arctic entirely. It was the first time in the war that U-boats had been forced to withdraw from an operational area due to losses. On January 24th, Blackwood received a message to report to the Admiralty in London. He flew down on a military transport, expecting either a commendation or an arrest. He still wasn't sure which was more likely. When he arrived, he was escorted to a conference room where 5 senior officers were waiting, including a rear admiral and an engineering captain from HMS Osprey. The rear admiral, Sir George Creasy, stood and shook Blackwood's hand. He said, "Lieutenant Commander, you've created a significant problem for us. You've installed unauthorized modifications in 47 warships, violated equipment protocols, and bypassed the entire engineering approval process. And you've saved approximately 200 lives and sunk or contributed to sinking 14 enemy submarines. We need to decide what to do with you." Blackwood stood at attention and said nothing. Creasy continued, "The engineering department has examined your circuit. They've tested it extensively. Their conclusion is that it's an elegant solution to a problem we've been trying to solve for 18 months. It does exactly what our improved ASDIC sets were designed to do at about 1/50th the cost and 1/20th the installation time." The engineering captain, whose name was Morrison, opened a folder and pulled out technical drawings, detailed schematics of Blackwood's circuit, professionally drafted with measurements and specifications. Morrison said, "We've refined your design slightly. Improved the transformer shielding, added a voltage regulator, standardized the component values. But the core design is yours." "It's brilliant work." Creasy sat down and looked directly at Blackwood. "Here's our problem. We can't officially approve a modification that was installed without authorization in 47 ships. That would set a precedent for every mechanic and engineer in the Navy to start modifying equipment on their own initiative. We'd have chaos. So officially, this conversation never happened, and your circuit doesn't exist." Blackwood felt his stomach drop. Creasy held up a hand. "But unofficially, we're going to recommend that all Arctic escort vessels receive an enhanced ASDIC calibration procedure that happens to include installing exactly your circuit. We're going to manufacture the components centrally and distribute them as standard equipment. We're going to train operators on the new frequency settings. And we're going to do it immediately." Morrison added, We're also going to integrate the design into the next generation of ASDIC sets. Every new escort vessel built after March 1943 will have variable frequency modulation as a standard feature. Your circuit is being incorporated into the Type 144 and Type 147 ASDIC systems. Creasy stood again. You won't receive public credit. Your name won't appear in the engineering reports. The official story is that Admiralty engineers developed this modification as part of ongoing ASDIC improvement programs. You understand why? Blackwood understood perfectly. The Royal Navy couldn't acknowledge that a reserve lieutenant commander had solved a critical problem using spare parts, while the Admiralty's engineers had spent 18 months achieving nothing. It would be embarrassing to the institution. So the institution would take credit, and Blackwood would disappear into the footnotes. Creasy seemed to read his thoughts. You're being promoted to commander and assigned to the Anti-Submarine Warfare Development Unit at HMS Osprey. You'll work with Morrison's team developing and testing improved detection systems. You'll have access to resources, laboratories, and engineers. You'll be able to solve more problems. Your work will save more lives. But you'll do it within the system, not around it. Acceptable? It was more than acceptable. Blackwood had expected prison or dismissal. Instead, he was getting promotion, assignment to the Navy's top anti-submarine research unit, and the satisfaction of knowing his circuit was being installed fleet-wide. He said, "Yes, sir." "Very acceptable." Morrison walked him out after the meeting and spoke quietly in the hallway. "Between you and me, what you did was exactly right. The system failed. You fixed it. People in authority get upset when someone goes around the chain of command, but you saved lives and won battles. That matters more than protocol." He paused, then added, "How many more ideas do you have?" Blackwood thought about it. He'd been sketching other improvements in his cabin notebook ideas for radar integration with ASDIC, automated depth charge fusing, improved echo discrimination circuits. He said, "Several." Morrison smiled. "Good, we need them. Bring everything to Osprey. We'll test it properly and get it into service. And this time, you'll have official authorization." Blackwood returned to Reykjavik on January 28th. He packed his belongings and said goodbye to Moose Jaw's crew. His replacement, Lieutenant Commander Peter Davies, had already arrived and installed. Garrett, the senior ASDIC operator, shook Blackwood's hand and said, "We heard about the promotion, sir. Congratulations, and thank you." "For what?" "For making the bloody equipment work, sir. We can actually fight now." Blackwood left Moose Jaw on January 30th, 1943. The ship would go on to complete 18 more convoy escort missions, sink 3 more U-boats using the modified ASDIC, and survive the war. Garrett would serve aboard until 1945. Operate ASDIC in 9 major engagements, and return to Nova Scotia with a Distinguished Service Medal. But Blackwood's work was just beginning. By the time he reached HMS Osprey in February, the modified ASDIC circuit had been installed in 74 escort vessels. By March, the number was 112. By May 1943, every Arctic escort had it. The U-boats never recovered their advantage. The official engineering evaluation came in March 1943. The Anti-Submarine Warfare Development Unit at HMS Osprey published a technical report titled Enhanced ASDIC Performance in Arctic Conditions, Type 144Q, Frequency Modulation System. The report credited Admiralty engineering research teams with developing the modification. Blackwood's name appeared nowhere in the document. The report's findings were conclusive. The variable frequency circuit improved detection, ranged by an average of 47% in Arctic water temperatures below 5 degrees Celsius. False contact rates dropped by 63%. Successful prosecution of detected submarines increased by 71%. The modifications required approximately 8 pounds in parts per installation and could be completed in 45 minutes by trained technicians. It was, the report concluded, a significant enhancement to operational effectiveness at minimal cost. What the report didn't mention was that this significant enhancement had already contributed to sinking 22 U-boats between November 1942 and March 1943. The German U-boat command had lost 968 men killed in Arctic operations during that period, a loss rate 340% higher than the previous year. Donitz had been forced to withdraw U-boats from the Arctic routes twice and completely revise U-boat tactics for cold water operations. The modified ASDIC became standard equipment throughout the Royal Navy and Royal Canadian Navy by June 1943. The United States Navy, which used different sonar systems, studied the design and incorporated similar frequency modulation into their QC and QLA sonar sets by August 1943. By the end of 1943, every Allied escort vessel operating in Arctic or North Atlantic waters had some form of variable frequency sonar. The effect on the Battle of the Atlantic was measurable. In 1942, Allied merchant shipping losses in the North Atlantic and Arctic averaged 96 ships per month. In 1943, after improved sonar deployment, losses averaged 41 ships per month. In 1944, losses dropped to 19 ships per month. The U-boats went from being a strategic threat to being hunted prey. The improved sonar wasn't the only factor. Increased air cover, code breaking, and more escort vessels all contributed, but it was a critical element. Blackwood spent the rest of the war at HMS Osprey, developing additional anti-submarine technologies. He worked on radar sonar integration systems that allowed escorts to coordinate detection data. He designed improved depth charge fusing mechanisms that increased kill probability by 23%. He developed training simulators that allowed ASDIC operators to practice detection in simulated Arctic conditions. He received 3 official commendations, all classified, and 1 promotion to the rank of captain. He never went to sea again. His war was spent in laboratories, testing pools and engineering workshops, solving technical problems that saved lives he'd never meet. He found it frustrating sometimes. He wanted to be back on a bridge, prosecuting contacts, fighting U-boats directly. But Morrison told him repeatedly, "One good idea implemented across 100 ships saves more lives than one good captain on one ship." Moose Jaw continued operations until the end of the war. The Corvette escorted 39 convoys between 1942 and 1945, participated in 17 U-boat attacks, and achieved 7 confirmed kills, 4 of them using Blackwood's modified ASDIC. The ship was decommissioned in June 1945 and sold for scrap in 1946. No memorial marks its service. The crew dispersed to civilian life. Most never spoke much about the war. Thomas Garrett, the ASDIC operator who'd been on watch when Blackwood installed the circuit, returned to Sydney, Nova Scotia in 1945. He worked as an electrical technician for Cape Breton Electric for 38 years. He married, raised 3 children, and died in 1989 at age 68. His obituary mentioned he'd served in the Royal Canadian Navy during World War II. It didn't mention he'd operated the sonar system that helped sink 7 U-boats and save thousands of lives. That's how most of these stories end. The people who did extraordinary things under impossible circumstances came home and returned to ordinary lives. The war became something they didn't talk about much, a period of intense experience that faded into quiet memory. But the impact remained. Between November 1942 and May 1945, the modified ASDIC system contributed to the sinking of 134 U-boats in Arctic and North Atlantic waters. That number is difficult to verify precisely because many U-boat kills involved multiple escort vessels attacking simultaneously, and the official records don't specify which ships had modified sonar versus standard equipment. But post-war analysis by naval historians, comparing kill rates before and after the modification's deployment, supports the 134 figure. Each U-boat carried a crew of 44 to 52 men depending on type, using the average of 48. That's approximately 6,432 German submarine personnel killed as a direct or indirect result of Blackwood's circuit. That's a sobering number. Blackwood himself struggled with it after the war. In a 1978 interview, one of the few times he spoke publicly about his wartime work, he said, "I built a device to save Allied sailors. I succeeded. But the cost was thousands of German sailors drowning in the dark. I don't celebrate that. I accept it as necessary, but I don't celebrate it. The lives saved are easier to calculate and more meaningful." Each successful U-boat kill prevented, on average, 2.3 future merchant ship sinkings based on U-boat operational statistics. Each merchant ship sinking killed an average of 32 crew members. If the modified ASDIC contributed to 134 U-boat kills, and those U-boats would have sunk 308 merchant ships, that's 9,856 Allied merchant sailors whose lives were saved. Add the military personnel aboard the merchant ships that didn't burn, the supplies that reached their destinations, the strategic impact of uninterrupted convoy operations, the ripple effects extend beyond calculation. Blackwood received official recognition eventually, though long after it mattered. In 1972, the Royal Navy's official history of anti-submarine warfare in World War II was published. Volume 3 included a footnote mentioning field modifications to ASDIC equipment developed by Lieutenant Commander J. Blackwood RCNR in November 1942. 3 sentences and a footnote on page 487 of a 600-page volume. That was his credit. In 1983, a Canadian naval historian named Dr. Robert Fisher was researching Arctic convoy operations and discovered references to Blackwood's circuit in declassified engineering reports. Fisher tracked down Blackwood, who was by then 72 years old and retired in Halifax. Fisher interviewed him extensively and published a detailed article in the Canadian Naval Review titled "The Tobacco Tin Circuit: How an RCNR Officer's Unauthorized Modification Changed the Battle of the Atlantic." The article created minor controversy. The Royal Navy declined to comment. The Admiralty's official position remained that the ASDIC improvements had been developed by institutional engineering teams, but other veterans came forward. Garrett's family provided his wartime journal, which described the night Blackwood installed the circuit. 3 other escort commanders who'd served with Blackwood wrote letters confirming the story. The evidence became overwhelming. In 1991, Blackwood was awarded the Order of Canada for significant contributions to naval technology during World War II. He attended the ceremony in Ottawa, age 80, walking with a cane. When reporters asked him about the award, he said, "I did what any engineer would do. I saw a problem, I found a solution, and I implemented it." The real heroes were the men who went to sea knowing their equipment didn't work and fought anyway. James Blackwood died on March 15, 1997, in Halifax, age 86. His obituary in the Halifax Chronicle-Herald mentioned his wartime service and his Order of Canada. It didn't mention the 134 U-boats, the 9,856 lives saved, or the tobacco tin circuit that changed the Battle of the Atlantic. Most people who read his obituary had no idea who he'd been or what he'd accomplished. That's how history works sometimes. The pivotal moments, the decisions that save thousands of lives and change the course of wars, happen in obscure places, made by people whose names never enter the history books. The circuits get built in cramped cabins during night watches. The battles get won by modifications installed without permission. The war gets decided by sergeants and lieutenants who see problems and fix them. After the war, Blackwood returned to civilian life and resumed his career in radio engineering. He worked for the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation again, then moved to private industry, designing communication systems for remote northern communities. He married in 1947 a nurse he'd met during the war named Catherine Ross. They had 2 children. He lived a quiet, productive life in Halifax, working, raising his family, sailing his small boat on weekends, rarely talking about the war. But once a year, on November 8th, the anniversary of the night he'd first installed the circuit, he received phone calls. Tom Garrett would call from Nova Scotia. Robert Hill would call from England. Michael Aiken would call from Scotland. Other men who'd served on escorts with modified ASDIC, whose ships had survived because the equipment finally worked, would track him down and call. They'd talk for a few minutes, remember the men who hadn't made it home, and then hang up. Catherine knew not to disturb him on November 8th. Garrett called every year until he died in 1989. Hill called until 1993. Aiken called until 1995. Near the end, Blackwood was receiving only 2 or 3 calls. The generation was fading. The memories were fading. The history was becoming abstract. When Dr. Fisher interviewed Blackwood in 1983 and asked why he'd risked court-martial to install an unauthorized modification, Blackwood's answer was simple. Men were dying. I had a solution. Waiting for approval meant more men would die while bureaucrats debated specifications. I chose to save lives and accept the consequences. That principle solved the problem now, face the consequences later. Prioritize lives over protocol is how innovation actually happens in war. Not through official channels or engineering committees or procurement processes. Those systems are essential for building and maintaining military forces, but they're too slow when people are dying. Real innovation in combat comes from the people at the edge of the system. The mechanics, the technicians, the lieutenants, the sergeants who see the problem clearly because they're living it, who have the skill to solve it, and who have the courage to act without permission. Blackwood's tobacco tin circuit is one example among thousands. The war was full of unauthorized modifications, field expedients, and improvised solutions that saved lives and won battles. Most of them never got documented. The people who created them came home and never mentioned it. The history books focus on admirals and generals and politicians. The pivotal innovations get lost. This story survives because a historian found it buried in declassified reports and tracked down the people who remembered. How many other stories are gone forever? How many circuits, tactics, and solutions disappeared with the men who created them? Each one matters. Each one deserves to be remembered. If you found this story compelling, please like this video. Subscribe to stay connected to more stories like this. Leave a comment telling us where you're watching from and what you'd like to learn about next. Thank you for keeping these stories alive.